O Lord of hosts, be with us, for we have none other help in times of adversity but Thee. O Lord of hosts, have mercy on us.
And that when we start to look at these superhero movies, which are, they're now 20% of the movie industry. They were less than 1% just 20 years ago. And now all of a sudden, they're almost a fourth of the industry. What's going on here? Well, I think it's really interesting to begin to think about superheroes as entities in a sort of alternative universe, of which the Marvel universe, the DC universe, whatever these comic universes are, they're trying to get us to, in a way, move into these universes conceptually. And so we begin to identify new heroes, new gods, in a sense. And I got a video of a guy watching Star Wars breaking down in tears, just awestruck by Star Wars, a trailer for it. And we see, I think it's tied to the betaization of men. That it is the sort of Betatheism, polytheism, the new polytheism, the new pagan pantheon of the Hollywood superheroes, and how we understand, the bossy lady that's walking around and she's dominating, 200-pound, 300-pound muscular men, and she's like 115. But we see now, more recently, with the DC and the Marvel superheroes, the political infusion of the values, for the LGBTQ emphasis, the feminism. And so we're seeing then a pantheon, and I'm going to lay this out here in my opening monologue, but pagan pantheons, all pantheons, historically speaking, are mythological structures, narrative structures of entities of which then collectivize those people. So Greek mythology, Nordic mythology, Germanic mythology, whatever it is, they collectivize those individuals into a group that then have a feedback. It's called a sacred canopy. I've talked about this with you guys multiple times. A sociologist named Peter Berger developed the concept of the sacred canopy. And this is a theory of how culture begins and how we sort of form the sacred canopy, the thing that we look up to, of our highest ideals, of our transcendental values. And that these superheroes really are modern day pagan gods. And that you look at then the people who become obsessed, and I'm sorry, no shots fired here for anybody who really likes some of the superhero movies. I know they do a great job with sort of the cinematic features of it, the amount of money that goes into their production. So no qualms there. And even if you're interested in watching them, no qualms. But I think the absolute growth and popularity within a 20-year period, and then we look at the change in values in our society. Again, the pedophilia, the normalization of pedophilia, minor attracted individuals, minor attracted, adults, the LGBTQ, the homosexuality, the sexual perversion, the collectivistic ideologies, whether it be communism or all this stuff. Interestingly, I think we see the dramatic rise in American culture on parallel with the dramatic rise of these comic book superheroes that, back in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, Batman still existed. It was nowhere near prevalent to the level it is today. Why is that? Could it be tied to the Christian values, the traditional values actually separated or prevented? There's a sort of small buffer to over-venerating, over-valorizing Marvel superheroes, DC superheroes, whatever it be. And so as that buffer has waned, that buffer is gone, I think a lot of men now are looking for heroism through the superheroes, which then exist in these universes that already are collectivistic, LGBTQ plus, in favor of all these different, feminism, that these Marvel universes, these DC universes, the Avengers, they're all getting men to create feedback loops of valorization for heroism that then exist in those universes. So their concept of progress is where we're at in 2022. We're going to move towards that. We can look at Star Wars, for example, how, the moon landing changed the way we saw space. And so then Lucas's film and Star Wars, it placed a spot within people that thought this is the future, right? This is a mythological, this is a Hollywood narrative, but it's where we're going, right? The space adventure. And yet now, that was in the 70s. Look at where we're at in 2022. And are we really that more advanced? Are we really that more progressed? I would say no. So I want to begin by saying that naturally, men seek stories and myths defining heroism. Really, when we get down to it, that's one of the most fundamental aspects of narrative. And we don't have to go any further than Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey. And I can pull that up and we can look at that a little bit in today's stream. But the hero's journey is the basis of all sort of powerful narrative structures. The hero leaves his home. He goes into a dark wilderness. He experiences a bunch of misfortunes or challenges of which he overcomes. And by overcoming them, he has a new identity, becomes a new man. And then he returns back home. And this journey is again, it's the redemptive journey of all hero figures. It's the hero's journey. And Joseph Campbell wrote an entire book on the hero's journey. So if you guys are more interested in that, you can look into it. But then we, as Orthodox, obviously, we worship the Logos. So we worship the source of narrative itself. We worship the second person of the Trinity, which is that which allows narrative and mythology and symbolism and semiotics and archetypes to exist in the first place. But this hero's journey, I think, is something that is fundamental to all forms of maturation of men. We don't have initiation rituals in our society like we used to, okay? And really Western society hasn't had many of them since we could talk about the Enlightenment or so on, but these sort of places, these thresholds in a man's life in which he passes through that threshold and now he's in a new stage. He's at a new place. The lack of any sort of initiation process, all men are sort of wandering into adulthood. When do I reach adulthood? Well, I'm 22 now. Well, I'm 28 now. Well, I'm 35 now. Am I an adult? Am I doing what I'm doing? What I'm supposed to be doing? And we see the absence of responsibility. We see men not having families, not pursuing, higher goals, higher ideals. And in a way, that is part of the sort of psychological operation that we're under to prevent us from reaching further. I mean, that's why traditional masculinity is considered toxic right now. And so superheroes are examples of contemporary heroism without the theology. And some of them are obviously pagan gods. Thor, Zeus, Loki. These are Nordic gods. These are ancient gods, Greek gods. And they're still part of these superhero pantheons, as I want to talk about. And so these superheroes are the new examples of contemporary heroism, except without the theology, without a larger transcendent value. And I think that's part of this trap, is that people have to idolize and look up to something. And you give them these Marvel movies, you give them the DC movies, you give them these superhero movies, and they then that is the limit of their plausibility, right? And so responsibility, when we look at the hero's journey, responsibility is always the heroic action. It's always the heroic action. It doesn't matter if we look into ancient Mesopotamian myths or Greek myths or ancient Chinese myths or, Amazonian stories within tribes that we've never heard of. All the stories, every one that describes a hero is going to require him to take on responsibility on behalf of others who could take on that responsibility or don't, or just can't take on that responsibility, and they can, and so therefore they do. Obviously, when we look at a hero in regards to the taking of responsibility, there is no hero greater than Jesus Christ. He dies for the sins of the world. He dies for everything that he didn't do, in a way. Now, again, that's just one aspect of our atonement theology. But heroes, what I'm going here with, is that heroes used to be overtly religious. Christ is moving out of society. We can even point back to Nietzsche in The Death of God. He's not wrong. Nietzsche wasn't wrong when he's railing at Western Christianity, Western Catholicism, and Protestantism, and the just lack, the impetus it has. And again, in the 19th century, it was weak. It was weak-willed, and he was right to say that God is dead. The Christian God in the Western form was dead. It's not appealing to people anymore. And so what then are people then? Now they're looking for something they need. Well, he gave them the Ubermensch. And even the Ubermensch, you could say, well, these superheroes, then it's just a kind of Nietzschean Ubermensch. Well, kind of, but a lot of them actually don't even match up. I mean, you look at a Bruce Wayne, technically he shouldn't be out there doing vigilante activity. Bruce Wayne as Batman, again, him being the sort of elite of society, he should be taking his power and crushing with his boot on the faces of the poor, on the average people, on the dregs of society. They're losers anyways. That's what an Ubermensch would do. You just elevate yourself to that status. There is no objective morality. There is no objective truth. Power is the only thing that exists in the Nietzschean Ubermensch reality. And so, at the same time, some of these superhero myths, they're not actually Nietzschean in that sense. I think Nietzsche's hitting on the death of God is very accurate because it then provides the fertile foundation for these superhero myths to really take hold in people's minds. And again, I have a video that's going to show this perfectly, within certain people. So heroes used to be overtly religious, and now, again, 20th century, God is dead. We see comics begin really at the beginning of the 20th century. You can point to the very end of the 19th century, but really the 20th century is when they get going, these comics. And so when we look at these superhero movies, they still, in a way, have a Christian morality. That's what the only reason it appeals to people, right? Why is Batman even good? Why is Spider-Man even good? Why I don't understand. Why are these entities even worthy of idolization and valorization? Well, it's because of their selflessness. Again, these heroic actions where they take on the responsibility. They fight the villain, right, on behalf of the collective, on behalf of the group. And so this is also tied to something that I've talked about with Max Weber, sociologist Max Weber, and what he recognized with the growth of Protestant theology. He saw the disenchantment of the world. He saw the rationalization, the rationalizing process of not only Protestant theology, which is a very rationalized understanding of Christianity, basically does away with mysticism. There is no really experiential, transcendent dimension there. I mean, there's prayer, and then you have people just talking about miracles and all this stuff, but this is not a controversial thing. Generally speaking, everybody would agree that Protestantism is a much more rationalized form of Christianity. And Max Weber is seeing this happen in the industrial Germanic time, again, in the 19th century. So Germany's they're going through their industrial revolution, and he's watching how this is affecting people. And he believed that these spheres of rationalization in society, whether it be industry or business or sports or all these things would take on their own spheres of rationality, and in a way it disenchants the world. There is no overly shared mythology anymore. That rationalization is a sort of the overshared mythology, and in so doing, it's disenchanting the world. And during that time, we saw the rise in magic as a sort of response to the disenchantment of the rationalizing process of the post-Enlightenment project. And so we see the death of God, 19th century, the death of God, Nietzsche, and we see Max Weber talking about the disenchantment of the world. I think this is essential for seeing how Christianity wanes out of Western society, slowly but surely, and there's no question that it has. And what's replaced it then is literally a sort of paganism. We see the paganism in the global climate change narrative. We see the paganism as really a sort of a very dominant strand of presuppositional theology for a lot of people. You ask your average New Ager, you ask your average person out there, and you start reframing questions in a sort of pagan context or talking about nature or nature spirits, I think we'd be surprised how many people really do have more of a pagan worldview. They may still adopt the Christian morality. Nobody wants to give up the Christian morality for some reason, but they definitely want to give up then the Christian responsibility and the Christian religion and the Christian worldview. But this has set a fertile ground for, again, a new pantheon. That's what these superhero movies are. That's what Hollywood is. You see, it's literally providing us pagan gods. The values of paganism are coming back. Human sacrifice, abortion, orgiastic activity, the multiplicity of sexual identities, pedophilia, the worship of nature, veganism. We see ancient forms of paganism coming back in the contemporary society as hip, as progressive, as cool. And this is moving us into, again, a world, as I talked about how Christ civilized the world, a world before Christ. And I think that these superhero movies are actually contributing to this because they literally are providing the sort of sacred canopy for the new pagan world. And so then you see the LGBTQ, the feminism, all this stuff in the pagan Marvel movies. Because those are universes, and they want you at a very subconscious level to think that you're also in that universe, and that the universe we're in is moving towards that universe if we could only just progress. If those darn people would just take their stabbies and wear their masks. And that's where you see it. The people who really love these movies, and I am not trying to castigate or point fingers. There's always exceptions to every rule, but many of them are very beta. Many of these men are in their 30s or their 20s. Comics, when they came out, were for kids. And I got a quote here, and we're going to look at it once we start getting into some of the evidence, of Alan Moore, the great comic artist, the magician, saying comics are for children, that this has been detrimental on society, that comics and superheroes are objects of attention for adults and adult men. Now, the author takes umbrage with this. He prefers comics and how great comics are. But when comics came out, you were considered illiterate if you're into comics and you didn't read actual books. And now we look at the literacy rates of our society declining rapidly. And we see comics also rise. And I'm not saying that all comics are bad. I'm not trying to say that. I'm just at a 12,000 foot. I'm a very abstract aerial view of this stuff. So there's always nuances in this discussion. But I think that it's a neotenizing effect. Neoteny is a scientific term for the retention of juvenile characteristics into adulthood. That's why I call this betatheism. Polytheism. Betatheism is becoming the man that venerates the pagan idols that Hollywood's giving you. You will become a beta because it's all about you like having hedonistic emotional responses, but not taking responsibility. As we said in the beginning, look at Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey. Every hero is tied to taking responsibility for something. Responsibility outside the capacity of which you might think he has. That's the point. But then the people who are watching these Hollywood movies, who are enamored with this whole Star Wars and Star Trek and Marvel versus DC, are in their actual lives. Is the heroes that they look up to being enacted in their life? Well, yeah, John Doe over there, he bought an Iron Man suit and he goes to Comic-Con. No, dude, that's not responsibility. Are you married? Do you have children? Do you have a career? Do you have a skill? Do you have a passion for something? Are you reaching beyond the limits that are capable right now? If you're not, then you're not actually being a man. That's the whole point. We're on a progress, and that's also carrying your cross. That is maturation. That is becoming mature. That is becoming a man. And so we see then the lack of initiation rituals, the lack of initiation in our society, and then the inundation with the pagan values, and now venerating these Hollywood figures on the big screen. What is going on here? And so as Christianity's influence on culture lessens, the appeal of superheroes increase. And again, I have an article that I'll show you guys. And within a 20-year period, superhero movies have gained over 19% of all Hollywood productions. It was like at the beginning of 2000, there was it was less than 1%. Less than 1% of Hollywood movies had anything to do with superheroes. Now it's over 20%. Well, what's going on? I argue that superhero movies are part of a betatization process. And so then even the superheroes themselves aren't as cool and masculine as they used to be. I mean, you look at a lot of the actors who play these superhero roles, and they're skinny, they're scrawny, they're little dudes. They don't have masculine auras, masculine presences, really out there doing their thing, just look at the 80s superheroes. Look at Arnold and Sylvester Stallone and Jean-Claude Van Damme, and then look at the people today. And you're like, oh, how come none of the guys who play superheroes anymore really have that big of muscles? What's going on? Because it's the redefining of masculinity. It's the redefining of heroism. It's reconfiguring heroes. And I think this is part of, I would argue, an occult process. That all these comic entities, and many of them are based on pagan gods themselves, overtly or, subtly, Hollywood is magically, through an occultic practice, taking two-dimensional figures in comics and creating, in a way, like three-dimensional big screen entities. They're taking comic book heroes through the big screen, through Hollywood. They're literally animating them as real entities to be valorized. And I think there's this really interesting rational component here, because when you look at some of the differences between the DC and the Marvel, is like how the superheroes relate to actually living in the same world that we live in. So I'm not an expert on these topics, but from my understanding, Marvel Comics, one of the interesting takes that it does is that all the superheroes exist in a sort of human world, and they live amongst humans. And that's part of, like, again, this rationalized process. It's a false form of Christ, right? Because that's what these superheroes are. Marvel, the superhero has transcendent value. He's kind of just like you. He's kind of like a man. Or the X-Men. Like, they're kind of like mutants, but they're kind of like you. And it's all just a sort of false version of Christ. It distorted. It doesn't even come close to equating to Christ. In the totality of heroism, the totality of its message and its meaning. And so Hollywood is literally creating, in my opinion, a new pagan pantheon, a sacred canopy, so that those people who then watch those movies and venerate those entities, they become part of a collectivized process. And therefore, I would argue, if you began to just do numbers on the people who take all these superhero movies seriously, who go, they buy the t-shirts, they buy the comics, they do all this stuff, and then you took their political values, I guarantee you the majority of them would be left of center. I guarantee you the majority of them would be in favor of a lot of the degeneracy that we as traditional Christians take umbrage with. We'll put it that way. And so, Isn't that ironic that I bet the majority of them actually promote, when it comes to political understandings, they promote things like socialism or even openly communist. Again, what are these ideas? They're collectivistic ideologies that obfuscate personhood and unique individuality in response for, well, you're just a number. This is the Great Reset. You're not going to own anything and you're going to like it. And in a way, that process is being instituted again through a pantheon of superheroes, that people are then looking up to these superheroes and they're becoming part of a betatization process where the men are more than likely actually going to fall left of center. Because in a way, the universes that they're venerating these heroes in are not the Christian universe, because our Christian universe is the real universe, right? Christ is the real hero of the actual universe. That's why we have a metaphysical theology to account for a lot more than just, he do great thing. It's more than that. And so Hollywood is creating a new pagan pantheon to collectivize people, whether they're conscientious of it or not. They insert their political agenda in the movies to normalize these new transcendent values. So, oh my gosh, I'm awestruck by Captain America. I'm awestruck by the Hulk and Superman. Oh, and then it has the openly gay character or the transgender child in it. Wow, what a great universe. I want to live in a place like that. You see, this is a psychological tool as much as anything else. So, they're trying to normalize their values, these political values, these progressive values, the global homo agenda, through their superhero movies, which then are the place throughout all of ancient society how men come to understand masculinity and heroism. It's through heroic stories. But what is the mythological narrative of Western civilization? It's no longer Christ. What is it? It's Iron Man. It's Spider-Man. It's Batman. It's Superman. It's Black Panther. And so these new values are part of a political and a spiritual effort, because this is ultimately a spiritual reality. This is part of a spiritual effort to take meaning and responsibility away from men, because that's the only way that you can be a hero. You and I cannot be a hero as a man unless we take responsibility, unless we move towards greater meaning in our lives. And having a bunch of Funko Pops or Star Wars memorabilia, this is not meaningful. This is neoteny. This is the maintaining of juvenile characteristics into adulthood. This is somebody who's never been initiated into being a man. This is the problem of Western civilization. This is Betatheism. That is the new polytheism. And so they are creating false universes for people so that the false notions of progress will lead them to these universes. Just like Star Wars did with this, with space travel and aliens and all this different stuff. If Star Wars and Star Trek didn't exist as television shows, how many people would still believe in UFOs and aliens? You see, this stuff is more pernicious than we think, really. These movies, these superheroes, the ways in which people are absolutely enthralled with them, it's more pernicious than we actually realize. And so I think, again, a traditional man, as I have an article and we'll read, testosterone levels are dramatically on the decrease. Dramatically on the decrease. Men aren't even as fertile as they used to be. Men can't even... if you're even with a fertile woman, you can't even have babies because your sperm's so low. You're so weak. They're not having families. I mean, they're not pursuing like longer, more meaningful goals in their lives. And that's what the world's trying to take from us. They don't want you to have children. They don't even want you to own anything. They want you to be a slave, and they want you to watch your Marvel and DC movies. And so Christian heroism is about enacting the path of Christ in our own life. That means that's a path of suffering. That means that's a path of more and more and more responsibility. And that means it's a path that's the most meaningful you could find.